misfortunate cryosleep does not work on robots.
So is it just me, or has Insomniac Games been on quite the hot streak as of late? This once independent studio is responsible for some of the most popular franchises in gaming, including Spyro the Dragon, Ratchet Clank, and more recently with their foray into the Marvel Universe with Marvel's Spider-Man and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. What started as a company trying to make a Doom clone for the 3DO has blossomed into one of the most well-known and well-respected studios in the industry, with a staggering 35 games released across several platforms. I want to talk about that incredible output and do what us YouTubers do, rank them. Now, to be upfront for a moment, I have not played every game that Insomniac has released, partly because I don't have an Oculus Rift, and some of the mobile titles that they developed are no longer available to be downloaded as far as I can tell. So I'm going to do the next best thing. I will be ranking each of the games released to home consoles, only eliminating the VR and mobile titles from this list. Even removing those games from the rankings leaves us with 25 total games to look at though, from their early days with Disruptor all the way up to earlier this year with Rift Apart. And obviously this all goes without saying, but this is all my own opinion on these games. So if I rank your favorite game lower than you think it should be, too bad, make your own video telling me why I'm wrong or something. We'll keep things simple and use the standard S, A, B, and so forth for the tiers themselves, unlike what I usually do. But I will have one difference for the lower tier, which I will dub the Snow Beast Award. If you're not already aware, the Snow Beast Award is an internal award of sorts that is gifted to a member of the team who created the worst part of a game once said game is set to ship. It's a fun little way to acknowledge their own faults within the studio, but in this case, it will be reserved for what I feel is the studio's worst release to date. Which game do I feel is most deserving of that reward, you ask? Well, sit back, relax, and let's wax nostalgic about one of the arguably best studios in the business for a bit, as I rank the majority of the games released by Insomniac. Number 1, Disruptor. The game that started it all, and by all accounts, an alright start for the studio. The game is as basic a Doom clone as they come, but with a surprising amount of platforming and FMV cinematics to shake things up a bit. The cinematics are cheesy to say the least, but do offer a uniquely cringe experience with some lines of dialogue that are just comedic gold.
Just remember, think fast, shoot fast, and kick ass.
The overall gameplay is really one of the main faults behind this game if you ask me. Since it's a Doom clone, it's hard to not compare it to it or that of some of its contemporaries, and while Disruptor has a wide variety of interesting weapons, the overall product is a bit lacking and unfocused. I like Disruptor and hope to have a legitimate physical copy of the game one day, but for the sake of this tier list video, Disruptor is going to be ranked at a B tier. Number 2, Spyro the Dragon. This was my and many other people's introduction to Insomniac, thanks to its cute character, innovative game design, and easy to pick up and play nature. Spyro is instantly recognizable these days as the little Sony mascot who rivaled Crash Bandicoot, and it all started with a nasty Nork and some draconic paralysis. That said, the first outing for everyone's favorite purple and gold dragon was probably his weakest entry in the original trilogy, but even then it was a heck of a lot of fun to play. The vibrant and open worlds invite you into a wonderful land of potential, and the simple to pick up and play controls, as I mentioned, mean just about anyone can experience this adventure for themselves. Simply compared to what comes after it, Spyro the Dragon is stuck as a B-tier game on this list. But that also means it only gets better from here. Number 3, Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage. One of the more common arguments I've seen when talking about the original Spyro trilogy online is, which game is better? Ripto's Rage or Year of the Dragon? And if you're a Ripto's Rage stan hoping for some good news in this video, I might be disappointing you a bit here. Don't get me wrong, Ripto's Rage is still a very fun game, doing a lot to improve upon the original in terms of gameplay, world design, bosses, and collectibles. That said, Ripto's Rage has too many collectibles, a few challenges that are infuriatingly difficult, and introduces one of Insomniac's favorite artificial game length extenders in the form of Moneybags the Capitalistic Bastard. But it does have the best final boss in the entire trilogy, and introduces a lot of fan favorite characters like Allura and Hunter. Overall, I love Ripto's Rage, but I feel it falls just short of its successor, and thus is dropped down one tier into the A tier. Number 4, Spyro, Year of the Dragon. Year of the Dragon is my personal favorite original Spyro trilogy game, but that's not to say it's without fault. It was clear to me even at a young age that Insomniac were running out of ideas on where to go with the series, since they added 4 entirely new characters to play as, each with their own movesets, levels, and even unique mini-games. But in terms of the collectibles and Spyro's levels themselves, everything is as polished as it possibly could be. Getting the Dragon Eggs as your primary collectible for level advancement is a much more manageable balance than orbs, talismans, and gems, and with all the levels working towards the final total, it makes for a much more cohesive and fun experience. Some of the challenges are still needlessly hard, but at the end of the day, Year of the Dragon is my personal favorite original Spyro trilogy game, and thus the Spyro game that makes it into the S tier. Number 5, Ratchet and Clank. The original game that introduced us to the Lombax and his defective warbot buddy, the first Ratchet & Clank might be a bit rough around the edges when compared to some of the games that would follow it, but it's still a solid experience to play through even more than 15 years later. The lack of strafing and auto-targeting makes for a slightly frustrating experience when it comes to combat, but this game has a much more healthy balance of platforming and combat than its future titles, so it's not necessarily as noticeable unless you've played all the games multiple times over like I have. It also doesn't help that in terms of characterization, Ratchet is a bit of a jerk towards Clank for a lot of the game, and it's something I'm glad they changed going forward about him. In general, I have fond memories of Ratchet & Clank, but most of the games released later are just better in my opinion. That said, I still love this game to death, and I will at least give it a B tier ranking on this list. Number 6, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando. This was actually the first Ratchet & Clank game I played after trying out a demo for it in Kmart, and is probably my personal favorite of the original trilogy of games. The improvements to combat from the original are very welcome in this adventure, the new weapons are fun to use, and the variety to the gameplay helps shake things up from the simple run and gun gameplay of the original. It does have a few curious design and story decisions, primarily with the likes of Angela Cross, a narrative addition that throws a whole bunch of omni-wrenches into the narrative they've been trying to reboot since Tools of Destruction. Going Commando is the game that introduced me to the franchise, but it isn't necessarily my favorite in the franchise. It's still a very fun game, and even then, it still earns an A tier spot on this list. And now we get to talk about the other good one in the trilogy. Number 7, Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal. Up Your Arsenal takes the militaristic ideas Going Commando started with and amplifies them dramatically, introducing several sections where you need to take on waves and waves of enemies in larger, more open areas than ever before. The classic platforming and run-and-gun style of gameplay is still there. We also get the introduction to Dr. Nefarious, probably the best written story in the entire trilogy, and a lot of fantastic worlds to explore with plenty of missions to complete while doing so. You can make a solid argument that this is the best Ratchet & Clank game on the PlayStation 2 era, and I would likely say you have a solid argument. But it wouldn't be enough to convince me that it's the best. Up Your Arsenal is a fantastic game with some incredible stuff to play and behold, but for this list, it's merely an A tier because of what comes next. Number 8, Ratchet Deadlocked. I know that with this one, I'm likely in the minority. I love Deadlocked, so much so that I've called it my favorite game in the Ratchet & Clank series for close to 15 years, and I will not back down from those claims now. One of my favorite aspects of the Ratchet & Clank games has always been the arena combat challenges, and when they give me a whole game of nothing but that, along with some of the best humor in the series, not much can top that in my mind. Deadlocked may have been the beginning of Insomniac's arguable inability to fully understand what to do with Ratchet & Clank, but for me, it's absolutely an S tier title, and I will hopefully have a retrospective out sometime in the future to tell you exactly why it's my favorite in the series. Number 9, Resistance: Fall of Man. Arguably one of the only good launch titles for the PlayStation 3, and one of the first games I played for the system before I even owned one, Resistance: Fall of Man has a lot of the staples that Insomniac is known for. A wide range of weird weapons that handle relatively well, all-right storytelling that meshes well with the gameplay, and a penchant for world building that is hard to top. The biggest problem this game has is that it's too muted in terms of the color scheme, and the enemy AI is definitely more A than it is I. Overall, it's a fine game, enough for me to at least refer to it as the best PS3 launch title, but I think it falters in just enough ways that this game is stuck with a B tier ranking. Maybe I'll do a video on the series at some point explaining some of the problems I have with this one and the others, but we'll see. Number 10, Ratchet Clank Future, Tools of Destruction. Tools of Destruction is a weird entry on this list. On the one hand, it was a nice showcase of the PlayStation 3's capabilities early in that console's life. It introduced some great weapons, gadgets, and more that would become mainstays for the series like the Groovatron, and it helped to expand the universe that those games take place in nicely. However, with a comically inept villain who is constantly presented as being more powerful than he seems, weird gameplay choices like having a separate item category in the form of non-upgradable devices, motion controls, and ending on a cliffhanger that was more frustrating than intriguing, it's hard to say that this game is more than just an alright entry in the franchise. In general, it's just an alright game, and as such I'll lump it into the B tier. But what follows, I won't be anywhere near as nice to. Number 11, Ratchet & Clank Future, Quest for Booty. Quest for Booty is nothing more than a 2-hour DLC expansion for Tools of Destruction, and it's not even a good one. It immediately invalidates the cliffhanger ending of Tools of Destruction, only to then offer its own cliffhanger ending for what would eventually become a crack in time, and everything in between was basically needless filler just for that final cutscene. There are one or two segments of traversal that are interesting, and more of the pirates from this universe are always nice. But ultimately this feels like one of, if not the biggest missteps in the history of this company. I almost feel bad calling it DLC. Instead, it just comes off as content that was supposed to be in Tools of Destruction that was cut due to time constraints or a lack of enthusiasm from the team, and it ended up being hastily slapped together and then packaged separately to justify a new cliffhanger ending because the other one pissed off a lot of people. Regardless of what might have happened, this is without a doubt my least favorite thing Insomniac has ever released, and as such, it is awarded my tier list equivalent of the Snow Beast Award. Now let me put that into perspective for a sec. The worst thing Insomniac released was bad DLC. Honestly, everything else just is better by comparison, but hey, you do you if you don't agree with me. Number 12, Resistance 2. Resistance 2 is polarizing for a number of reasons. On one hand, you have a game that greatly improves upon the original in terms of gameplay, enhances the graphics, and has marginally better AI. On the other hand, they turned the once emotive and relatively unique protagonist Nathan Hale into generic action hero number 384. There isn't much else done to the gameplay to make it any better than the first outside of minor tweaks and improvements, and the story is somehow more depressing than the original. Overall, I kind of think Resistance Fall of Man and Resistance 2 are about the same quality, but for different reasons. So I'll slap a B tier ranking onto this game as well, and we'll just move on. Number 13, Ratchet & Clank Future, A Crack in Time. Tools of Destruction was alright, and its DLC was probably the biggest mistake the studio ever made. So how did Insomniac close out Ratchet & Clank's time on the PS3? Well, not with this game, but they did give us at least one of the best titles of the Future saga. A Crack in Time is an excellently built Ratchet & Clank game, featuring some of the best weapons, planets, gadgets, and characters, while also actually answering some lingering questions about the Lombaxes. The wide open areas of several worlds offer a lot of opportunities for large-scale battles, and this game finally gave us good Clank gameplay in the form of his time manipulation puzzles, something that the series has struggled with since the very first game. If anything, this game is just bogged down slightly by being restricted to the previous game's storyline, and as such, I will begrudgingly leave this game in the A tier. Number 14, Resistance 3. Resistance 3 is the darkest, most violent entry in the entire series in terms of story and setting, but in terms of gameplay, it felt like a bit of a regression. It's still fun to play, don't get me wrong. I especially enjoyed the multiplayer back when the servers were still up, which is something I can say about all three games, honestly. But something about the gunplay and AI movement for this one just felt a bit stunted, especially when compared to the improvements made in Resistance 2. It's not enough to knock it down a peg or anything, and while the game itself is probably my least favorite to revisit, that's more because I feel like I need to play all 3 of these games back to back, and by the time I get to 3, I'm just burnt out on the series. In general, Resistance 3 is a nice cap on the series overall, and fits right alongside its predecessors as another B-tier entry on this list. Number 15. Ratchet & Clank All for One. Ratchet & Clank has always kind of had a problem when it came to multiplayer, never really figuring out a good way of accomplishing it while staying true to form. All for One was a nice attempt at making a 4-player cooperative experience, but it's painfully easy, has some of the easiest puzzles in the franchise, and some of its dumbest enemies. Even the more kid-friendly tone might be nice for younger players, but it does little to appease longtime fans like me. I just think this was a pretty big misstep for the studio, but it can at least be fun to play with friends on occasion, so I don't feel too bad just leaving it down in the C tier on this list. Number 16, Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault. I love tower defense titles like the Orcs Must Die series, where the game lets you actually get in on the action directly with a slew of weapons of your own, as well as an assortment of traps to help dispatch waves and waves of foes. I also love the Ratchet & Clank games, with their weird weapons and fun characters. Full Frontal Assault tries to combine these two to a middling success at best, and by the time I was done playing, I was eager to just be away from it. It doesn't control bad or anything, it just feels like an afterthought in a lot of areas, most notably in terms of the traps that you can place and the largely barren level design. Overall, I feel like it was another good attempt at branching out for this franchise, but it fell short of its promise, and thus I stick it with its co-op cousin in the C tier. Number 17, Fuse. One of the only games I had not played prior to making this video. I was interested in Fuse after reading the Game Informer article about the game, but never picked it up after that for some reason. And now that I've had a chance to finally play it, I'm kind of glad I skipped it. Fuse is a mediocre third-person shooter with bland characters and an overly cliché story, but it does at least have fun gameplay, decent co-op, and some cool guns. I think if this game had come out even 5 years earlier than it did, it would have been much better received, but by the time this had come out, the genre of co-op third-person shooters was already growing stale. In general, Fuse is just a mostly forgettable game that I might try and play all the way through with some friends, otherwise it's just a C-tier ranking on this list. Number 18, Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus. The fact that this game technically canonizes Wang Chung into the Ratchet & Clank universe alone gives it points, but Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus is a return to form for the series after a slew of experiments, and almost feels like the additional standalone adventure Insomniac had hoped that Quest for Booty would be seen as. It's a nice little capper to the future series of games with some neat new weapons, some fun gravity gameplay that I wish came back in Rift Apart, and has one of the most playful soundtracks in the series, Wang Chung notwithstanding. In general, I think Into the Nexus is a nice game that I wish was just a little bit longer, but it's because of this game that we eventually got Rift Apart, so I'm willing to give this mostly good adventure an A-tier ranking. Number 19, Sunset Overdrive. Sunset Overdrive was one of the only reasons I was interested in getting an Xbox One when that originally came out, and the fact that the game was developed by Insomniac was only a small reason as to why. The original Xbox One showcase was rather lacking in my opinion, and this was a wonderfully over-the-top and bombastic surprise compared to the mostly grimdark showcase. The vibrant world, movement-heavy combat, wacky weapons, and unique on a zombie takeover are all excellent reasons to play this game. And it's one that I like to return to every once in a while thanks to Game Pass. I unironically consider this game to be one of my favorite games ever made, and it will absolutely sit high on this list among the other S-tier entries. If you haven't played it and are interested, go play it for yourself. I honestly think more people just need to play this game. Number 20, Slow Down Bull. Along with Fuse, this was the only Insomniac game I hadn't played before making this video, mainly because I had never heard of it before. Slow Down Bull is an overall fun game, but the main mechanic can get a bit old rather quickly. It's a very casual experience of just running, collecting, and trying not to make Esteban angry because you're turning him. The gameplay is simple, and the arts and crafts style of the game where everything is made out of construction paper and popsicle sticks is charming to say the least. If nothing else, this $2 game made to help promote Insomniac's partnership with the Starlight Children's Foundation is a nice little diversion from their usual fare of mostly combat-focused games, but it doesn't really get much more than a B-tier ranking for the simple fact that there isn't really much to do in it. Number 21, Ratchet Clank, the 2016 one. Movie tie-in games are rarely ever good, and while I wouldn't really call Ratchet & Clank 2016 a bad video game, I can certainly say it was better than the movie it was tied to. The remake of the original game with a few changes to the story, Ratchet & Clank is a fine enough game to play, but more in that I played it once and now I'm done with it since. It has some good visuals, some fun weapons, and snappy dialogue that you would expect from the series, but is held back from being a tie-in with the movie that is best avoided if you want to have a nice life, and restricted by the fact that it's a remake of the original game. In general, I think it's just alright, and as such I'll let it sit in the B tier considering it's better than some of the low points of this studio, and we'll just move on. Number 22, Song of the Deep. A passion project by Insomniac's chief creative officer Brian Hastings. Song of the Deep is a nice little Metroidvania adventure he wanted to make because he wanted to, quote, feature a heroine his daughter could look up to. Playing as Marin, players navigate a beautifully stylized underwater labyrinth inside a small submarine in search of her father, focusing less on combating the denizens of the deep and more on environmental storytelling and puzzle solving. The game has a few problems, most notably in how the submarine controls, but is otherwise a lovely little title that I honestly recommend checking out. It's nothing that'll blow you away like some of the studio's other outputs, but is certainly worth the 5 to 6 hours it takes to complete the game, and as such I say earns a B tier ranking on this list. Number 23, Marvel's Spider-Man. For the longest time, I thought that Rocksteady's Arkham series of Batman games were the pinnacle of making a superhero game. A clear understanding of the character and of their mythos, incredibly well-crafted gameplay, and an engaging story featuring multiple well-known and surprising villains highlighted the series. And then Insomniac gave us Spider-Man. Some will say that the original Spider-Man 2 is the absolute best game when it comes to Spider-Man games, but not me. Insomniac hit the nail on the head with this one, and I don't think anyone else could have made a better game. There are certainly flaws with this game, most notably the Miles and Mary Jane stealth sections, but those are maybe 8% of the total experience, so I let it slide. If you ask me, this is the best superhero game out there. It easily earns an S ranking on this list, and I have high hopes for the future of Insomniac's endeavors into the Marvel Universe, including our very next game we're talking about. Number 24, Marvel's Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Miles Morales picks up a few months after the events of the first game, where Peter goes on vacation, leaving the keys to protecting New York to the newly Spiderified Miles. The best thing this game did was give Miles not only his own set of unique moves with his camouflage and venom powers, but also unique animations for his combat and swinging. As a showcase for how talented Insomniac is as a studio, as well as the power of the PlayStation 5 right out the gate, Miles Morales is a great showcase, but is sadly short. If this was even an hour longer or had some other form of side quest, I would likely rank this higher, but for now, it will sit as an A tier entry on this list. I will be forever grateful for this game for introducing Spider-Cat into my life, and I will patiently wait for 2023 and the return of these lovable Spider Boys. And finally, number 25, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Speaking of games that really show the power of the PlayStation 5, Rift Apart is a fantastic way to close out this list because it's in general just a fantastic game. It takes everything that's great about this franchise, coalesces it into a package that's stunningly beautiful, gives us new representations of beloved characters with their alternate universe counterparts, and gives us just an incredible game to play. Newcomers Rivet and Kit are welcome additions to the franchise, and I eagerly await whatever the team has in store for this series going forward. Hopefully including finally answering some more lingering questions that persist from as far back as the original game. Either way, Rift Apart is probably my second favorite game in the franchise behind Deadlocked, and I have absolutely no qualms giving this game an S tier ranking. And there you go, 25 games released by one of my favorite game studios, ranked based on if I like them or not. I might do something like this again in the future with other studios, but I don't think there are many other studios with quite as extensive or impressive of a library as Insomniac Games. If you want to suggest a studio, please do so in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll just see what comes up in the future and go from there, I guess. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Do all that fun YouTubey stuff down below in the comments. Follow me on Twitter if you already don't, where I post the occasional poll and some silly stuff like this. And I will see all of you in the next video. Take care.